Bienvenue à tous pour cette conférence de Sébastien Lachapelle. Welcome everyone for Sébastien Lachapelle's thesis defense. Very important time in a researcher's life. So the supervisor is Simon Lacoste-Julien. I'm the chair of the jury, and Dhanya Sridhar is the member. And who is the dean's representative? Sorry. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry. And so we're gonna listen to. Oh, Aapo, you're here. Nice to see you. Do you hear me? Yes, great. And Aapo is the external examiner. Thanks for being here. And thanks, Simon, for reminding me I'm not doing my work properly. So Sébastien, you have about 45 minutes, and then the jury will ask questions, maybe in a couple of rounds. So you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. I'll just close this. All right. So yeah, welcome everyone. It's very nice to see many familiar faces. I want to start quickly by thanking the members of the jury for engaging with my work and being today, either in person or remotely. I also have a few more thanks that I will keep for the end. I also want to thank my collaborators, so I won't have time to acknowledge all of them individually, but you will see their faces throughout the presentation. All right, so let's start. Okay, so writing my thesis was a nice opportunity to sort of go back to the basics and think about the meaning of machine learning. And I came to the maybe obvious conclusion that machine learning and statistics are fundamentally about inductive reasoning, which is the problem of inferring a general rule from a limited set of examples. And already back in the 1700s, the philosopher David Hume understood that this was a difficult problem, and he essentially noticed that in order to be able to do any kind of valid inductive reasoning, you need to assume that nature is somehow uniform, that things are nice and smooth. And so a classical example of this is that the physical laws of physics are the same across space and time. Okay, and this is now known as the uniformity of nature principle. And I would argue that machine learning is about exploring different ways in which nature can be uniform. And sort of the word that we use for this in machine learning is inductive bias. And so inductive bias is any kind of assumption about the data made by the learning algorithm. And so we have, of course, standard examples of this in literature. We have the very well-known IID assumption, independence, and identity distributed examples, and of course, the equivalence translation in convolutional neural networks. Okay. And so fast forward a few hundred years later, we have the statistician Leo Breiman, who wrote this very influential paper called The Two Cultures, where he basically contrasts the more traditional, maybe statistical perspective with the more recent, at the time, machine learning perspective. And basically what he says is that in statistics, we tend to focus more on simpler parametric models that are interpretable, whereas in machine learning, we maybe don't care so much about interpretability, and we go with very expressive models, maybe like neural networks. And this allows us, of course, to work with higher dimensional data like images, as long as we have sufficiently large data sets to back them up. And even at the level of the theory, so in statistics, we want to prove confidence intervals, hypothesis tests. And in order to do that, we often have to do stronger assumptions about the data generating process, the DGP. And this is not always the case, but this is often true. Whereas in machine learning, if you look at the generalization bounds, we typically make much milder assumptions, like only IID. Okay, and so I would say that today deep learning is sort of pushing this machine learning philosophy to its limit, in the sense that we consider more and more expressive architectures, and we sort of back them with larger data sets to be able to learn meaningful patterns. All right. And so, I don't have to say to this crowd that, deep learning has got really amazing success and made really important advances. But there are still some caveats. For instance, there are sometimes difficult to interpret. They can be black boxes. They require a large amount of data, and they are sensitive to environmental changes. And so the ambition of this thesis is to somehow get the best of both cultures, the best of both worlds, by proposing models that are both sufficiently expressive to capture complex data while being restricted enough to be interpretable and generalized better. Okay, so that's kind of the ambition. And the methodology that I employ in this thesis, in more or less all my contributions, is the following. So basically, I start by assuming that the data presents some kind of structure. So you can think of this as maybe your prior knowledge about the data. And then I propose a learning algorithm that will sort of extract this structure. And this is where I propose identifiability guarantees. So these are basically theoretical guarantees that gives basically conditions under which you are guaranteed to recover the structure. And once you've learned the structure, you can get either improved interpretability or improved generalization in some cases. Okay, so that's the sort of high-level view. Okay, so what is identifiability? So identifiability is a property of a statistical model. So statistical model is just a family of distribution parameterized by some parameter theta. And we say this model is identifiable if for any pair of parameters, if these parameters entail the same distribution, it means that the parameters are actually the same. Okay, so another way to say that is if I give you the distribution, you can infer what the parameter is. And so this is sort of the classical definition. In this thesis, I consider like a weaker notion of identifiability where we won't be able to identify exactly the parameter. So we will only be able to identify an equivalence class of parameters. And I will give an example of an equivalence class later. But basically, the intuition is that when we consider very expressive models, we cannot necessarily pinpoint the parameter. Okay, so that's for identifiability. And so why should we study identifiability in the first place? Well, I will try to argue that identifiable models can be a great tool for scientists to actually do science because these models tend to be more interpretable. I will also argue that sometimes identifiability guarantees comes with generalization guarantees. I will give a few examples of that in the talk. And I will also show how sometimes identifiability guarantees can be used to gain insights into existing algorithms. Okay, so these are sort of the three main motivations that I will talk about today. And this is the list of papers that I will cover in this talk. And so as I will go through them, I'll try to sort of point these different motivations along the way. So keep an eye out for these little icons. Okay, so this is a list of the contributions that I participated to during my PhD. So of course they are. I cannot talk about all of this today. So here's the list of the papers. Okay, so all the contributions I will talk about today will be about disentanglement. So this is really an important slide. And so I start with a trained generative model. So here I have a latent vector z. So this latent vector it's latent, it's hidden, we don't observe it. It's sampled from some distribution pz hat, and we have a decoder function f hat. Maybe this is a neural network that takes this latent vector and outputs an image. Okay, and maybe this was trained with a diffusion model or a VAE or something like that. Okay, pick your favorite method, and we see that the model is disentangled if it looks like this. So basically, what I'm showing here is I'm changing only one latent factor in the latent space, and I'm sort of decoding this trajectory of latent code into images, and I look at what happens. And what you can see is that there's only one object that's moving. So here only the robot is moving. So in this case, I would say that the model is disentangled. Whereas if I have something like this, so again, I change only one component in my latent representation, my latent vector. And what you can see is that all the objects are moving, right? So both the robot and the ball are moving. And so I would say that this is entangled. Okay. And so disentanglement is this situation where you have this nice one-to-one correspondence between sort of the coordinates of your representation and the natural factors of variation. So here the natural factors would be the positions of the objects. All right. So we can be a bit more mathematical about this definition. So what we do is we introduce the notion of a ground truth decoder. So I will denote it by F without a hat. And basically this ground truth decoder is sort of telling you what are the natural factors of variation. And so this is sort of a theoretical tool to talk about this entanglement in a more sort of mathy way. And so you can think of so this latent space is actually corresponding to the positions of the objects in the image. And so once we have this ground truth decoder, we can look at what I like to call the entanglement map. So this is essentially, so this map is really important. So it will come around a few times during the presentation. And basically what it does, it's essentially the composition of F hat with the inverse of F. Okay? So composition of the learned decoder with the inverse of the ground truth. And basically what it does is it takes a point in this space. So this is the space of learned representation. You map it to the space of images, and then you take the inverse of the ground truth decoder to get the corresponding point in the ground truth latent space. Okay, so this is sort of translating the learned representation into the ground truth representation. And so if we have something like this, we would say that the model is disentangled. So again, what I'm doing is I'm sort of choosing an axis-aligned basis in the learned representation, and we can see what it looks like in the ground truth representation. And we can see that it's still axis-aligned, so that's good. So that's the case of disentanglement. If I have something like this instead, where the basis is no longer axis-aligned, then it means the model is entangled. So this is maybe another way to think about disentanglement. And I want to give you like another way to think about it. And so via the notion of entanglement graph. Okay? And so basically we can look at the dependency graph of this entanglement map. So what is the dependency graph? So remember that this function here is a vector-to-vector function. And so what we can do is for every output of this function, we can look at what are the relevant inputs for this output. Okay, so what is basically the structure of the dependency in this function? And so, for instance, this dependency graph is telling you that Z2 depends only on Z1 hat, Z3 depends only on Z2 hat, and so on and so forth. Okay, and so we will call the dependency graph of the entanglement map the entanglement graph. So I will use this word sometimes, entanglement graph. And when the entanglement graph looks something like this, so when I have this nice sort of one-to-one correspondence between the coordinates of the learned representation and the coordinates of the ground truth representation, I will say that I have disentanglement. Okay. When I have something like this, so everything depends on everything, I will say that the representation is entangled. Okay. So this is maybe a more graphical way of thinking about this. All right, so just going back to the notion of equivalence relation that I mentioned before, we can define an equivalence relation over the space of decoders in the following way. So basically we say two decoders are equivalent if and only if their entanglement graph has a one-to-one structure, okay, like this one. And so you can show that this is actually an equivalence relation. And yeah, so this is called equivalence up to permutation. Okay. Okay, so why is this entanglement hard? And so, this is actually an identifiability issue. So I'll try to explain this now. So basically, I start again with the same simple generative model. I have my latent code Z. My observation X is given by f of Z. And this, of course, induces a distribution over the observation X. Okay, so maybe this is a distribution over images. What I'm doing now is I'm considering a second model, theta hat, with parameter P, Z hat, and F hat. And the way I define those is in the following way. So basically, I say, okay, PZ hat is essentially the push forward of PZ under some invertible transformation. So V here is just some arbitrary invertible transformation. And I define F hat to be F precomposed with the inverse of V. And so, of course, by design, if I sort of look at the distribution induced by these parameters, I get the same distribution as in the original model, because V and V minus 1 will sort of cancel each other out. Okay, so both of these models have the same distribution, But, and this is really important, their representations are very different, might be very different, because now we have this sort of transformation, which is arbitrary. So it could be some kind of rotation of the space and so on. And so if you care about this entanglement, this is sort of a problem, because in practice the only thing that you see is this distribution over observation. So there's no way for you to know what is the right representation. Okay? And so to get around this problem, what we need to do is we need to add a structure to the problem. We will need assumptions. And so in order to prevent these kinds of symmetries in the parameter space, we need to restrict our structure PZ or the function f. And so we'll see that in the first contribution, we will sort of add structure to PZ, and in the second contribution, we'll add structure to the function f. All right. And of course, before I started working on this topic, there was already a rich literature on independent component analysis. And so the very classical method is ICA, and so it's in the linear case. So in ICA, what we do is we restrict the distribution over latence to be independent and non-Gaussian, and we also restrict f to be linear. Okay, and once we do these restrictions, we can show that we have identifiability up to permutation. Okay, so up to permutation, as we saw before. So we have this entanglement basically. Also later, people have shown that we can also get this entanglement by considering nonlinear decoders. Okay, so here we just assume that f is a diffeomorphism, so it's not necessarily linear. And what we do here is we assume independence of the latence, but we also add temporal dependencies. And so when we have that, we can show that this entanglement is possible. Okay, and there's also a lot of other approaches in the literature, and here I'm just giving a quick list. Okay, so this is obviously non-exhaustive. All right. Okay, so now I jump into the first contribution, which is titled Disentanglement via Mechanism Sparsity. This was published at TIER 2022. Also submitted a workshop version, an extended workshop version that received the Best Paper Award at UAI in 2022. And it's now yet another version is under review at the Journal of Machine Learning Research as we speak. All right. And so here's the approach. So again, we have our little generative model. So now we have three objects. The position, and the latent factors here would be the position of the tree, position of the robot, and position of the ball. And as I said before, in order to get this entanglement, we need to add structure to either the decoder or the latent space. And so what we do now is we sort of assume that we have sparse temporal dependencies or access to an action that has a sparse effect on the latent variables. And so let me explain a bit more. So now we have a dynamical system in the latent space. And this graph is sort of telling you the structure of the dependency. You can think of it as a causal graph if you want. So for instance, you see that the robot can have an effect on the position of the ball. And for instance, the ball cannot have an effect on the position of the robot. Okay, so maybe the ball is too light to influence the position of the robot. And so you can tell some kind of story about this graph. And the important thing is that this graph is sparse, right? So some edges are missing in this graph. Similarly for the action here has only an effect on the robot. And so yeah, so some edges are missing also there. And basically the contribution of this work is to show that if you learn a model like this, and if you regularize this graph to be sparse, this will essentially give you disentanglement of the representation under some conditions, of course. Okay, so let's go into maybe more details. So these are the three components that we need to learn. In the generative models, we have the latent graph G, we have the latent transition model, and we have the decoder function that goes from the latent space to the observation. So the transition model, it has this form, so it's just PZ T given the previous latent factors and the previous actions. And basically, we assume that it factorizes according to G. And in practice, the way we implement this is we basically have one neural network per conditional, and we have stochastic gates to sort of decide what are the parents. Okay, so that's for the latent transition model. And once we have all of these three things together, we can compute the distribution over observation. Okay, and so this is the distribution of the sequences of observations given the sequences of actions. Again, we can compute that just by marginalizing out the latent variables. Okay, so here's sort of the high-level view of the identifiability result that we could prove. And so we have a few assumptions. So first of all, we assume that the model fits the data. So basically now we have two models. We have p theta and p theta hat. And essentially, you can think of p theta hat as being the learn model, and p theta is the ground truth model. And so we have a match between the two. First assumption. We also have the sufficient influence assumption. This is sort of a technical assumption that I will not present here. I have supplementary slides if you're interested during the Q&A. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It's basically telling you that the transition model is sufficiently complex. Okay, I'll just say this. And maybe the more important assumption is this sparsity regularization assumption. And what it tells you is that the number of edges in the learn graph is smaller or equal to the number of edges in the ground truth graph. So this L0 norm is sort of counting the number of edges. And you can really think of this as being just regularization. We don't want the learn graph to be too dense. Once we have all of this, we can show that the entanglement map, so the function that we saw before, this V function, must have a sparse dependency structure. And here I'm being obviously a bit vague, right? So what do I mean by sparse dependency structure? So basically the contribution of the work is to sort of characterize precisely the relationship between the ground truth graph G and the structure of the entanglement map. And so we have like some kind of formula to do this computation. I won't present it today, but that's something that we do in the paper. So now I just want to give you some examples of what you can do with this kind of result. So in the top row, you have different ground truth graphs in the latent space. So this is the temporal graph, right? So it's connecting ZT minus 1 to ZT. And here I have the simple situation where I have independence, right? So I don't have sort of crosstalks between my latent variables. And when I have a graph like this, the theorem sort of can predict that the entanglement structure will have this form. So you'll have sort of perfect disentanglement. Okay, and this is sort of analogous to the work that I just mentioned before, permutation contrastive learning. So where we have independence between the latent factors. If you look at this example, now I have some crosstalks between my latent variables, and you can see that even in this situation we can still have this entanglement. Okay, so this is sort of a new result that was not present in the literature before, where we have now dependence between the latent factors. We also, if you consider this other graph, we can show some weaker form of disentanglement, right? So here, what this entanglement graph is saying is that Z1 is sort of disentangled from the other variables. Z2 and Z3 are disentangled from Z1, but Z2 and Z3 are sort of entangled together. Okay, and so this is what we call the partial disentanglement. And so we can really sort of do this. The theorem tells you how to do these computations. We can also do that for action graphs where we have actions targeting latent variables. We can also think of these as being intervention variables. Okay. We can also do some experiments. So what we did here is we trained this model using a variational autoencoder framework. We used Gumbel sigmoids to learn the graph. And we have a sparsity constraint to enforce sparsity. And what we do here is we train basically on synthetic data. So we know what the ground truth graph should be. So this is the ground truth graph. And this is the graph estimated by our method. So you can see there's like a pretty good match. And similarly, we can also look at the entanglement graph. So this is the entanglement graph predicted by the theory. And this is the entanglement graph that we recover in practice. Okay, so you can see again that there's a fairly good match, and we can do that also for all sorts of data sets. I want to quickly mention this follow-up work by Romain Lopez and Natasha Tagasovska from Genentech, where they essentially applied our method and sort of adapted also to single-cell genomics data with perturbations. And so now the action corresponds to interventions on the genes, either genetic or chemical, and basically the observation is a vector of gene expression, and they can learn latent variables that corresponds to biological processes. Okay? So this is, I think, a nice example of how identifiable models can be used to do science. All right. Okay, so going to the next contribution. So this is additive decoder for latent variables identification and Cartesian product extrapolation. This was presented as an oral at NeurIPS last year. Okay, so we have the, two main motivations for this work. The first one is we want to explain why object-centric representation learning methods perform disentanglement when they are trained only to reconstruct without any kind of supervision. And so here below we have the flat attention model, which is performing some kind of disentanglement by segmenting the objects and representing them in different slots, as you can see. Okay, so the surprising thing about this observation is that this model is trained, without segmentation labels. So it's completely unsupervised, and somehow it's still able to do this kind of segmentation. And so I think there's at the moment there's no clear mathematical explanation for why this is happening. So I think identifiability might be part of the answer. The second motivation has to do with basically creativity in modern generative models. So we now have these impressive models that are able to, they seem to be able to recombine known concepts in novel ways. So everyone has seen this cool avocado armchair example from Dali. And again, I think that maybe identifiability could bring insights into these kinds of models. Okay, so to tackle these two maybe ambitious goals, what we do is we introduce additive decoders. Okay, so additive decoders is a simple architecture that's very similar to the architectures that are used in practice and object-centric representation learning, for which we can prove both disentanglement and extrapolation guarantees. Okay, so we sort of simplify the architecture a bit such that we can prove disentanglement and extrapolation guarantees. All right, and I will just highlight quickly that I think this is maybe an example of work where an identifiability analysis bring insights into existing machine learning algorithms. All right. Okay, so here's what I mean by an additive decoder. And so X here is the observation, like an image. F is the decoder again. Z is the the vector of latent factors. Calligraphic B is a partition of the dimensions of Z. So this is a set of subset of indices, right? So this is a partition. And ZB is a subblock of Z, and we assume that these blocks are non-overlapping. And so here's an example where this additivity assumption makes sense. And so basically we have that the image is essentially just balls moving in space, and we can represent this image as a sum of two ball-specific images. Okay, and so the idea is that here the sum is really taken into pixel space. And the idea is that these block-specific decoders, FB1 and FB2, are outputting these object-specific images. And you can think of ZB1 and ZB2 as being maybe the XY positions of both balls. Okay, so that's at least one example where this additive decoder makes sense. And I will just jump right into the theorem, the disentanglement guarantee. And so we have, again, a few assumptions. So we assume the data generating process is additive, as always. So we need to assume that the model has enough capacity to represent the ground truth. And here we assume that Z is sampled, again, from some distribution PhD train. The learn decoder is additive as well. The ground truth decoder is sufficiently nonlinear. This is, again, a technical condition that I won't get into, but it's basically asking that the ground truth decoder is sort of curved sufficiently in all directions. And we also need some more regularity condition, like we need the decoder to be invertible. Okay, once we have all of this, we can prove the following. So if I solve the reconstruction task, so what is this loss? This is just the expectation over the training set of the L2 loss between the actual sample and the reconstructed sample. So hey, so F hat here is my additive decoder, G hat is some encoder. And basically, if I set this loss to be equal to 0, I can guarantee that the entanglement map will have a block permutation structure. So what I mean by this is the following. So the entanglement graph will have this form. So basically, I have some kind of one-to-one matching between the blocks in the ground truth in the learn representation and the ground truth representation. And so what this says is that the blocks are disentangled from each other, but the coordinates within a block can be entangled. Okay, so it means I can sort of separate the objects, but I might not be able to identify the coordinates of their positions, for instance. And so something worth maybe mentioning is that we make very weak assumptions on the distribution over the latents. So basically, the latents can be dependent, and they can have sort of a very weirdly shaped support, right? The support of this distribution could be like some weird potato with maybe a hole in it. So it's very general. And also note that in the learning algorithm, right, we're just doing reconstruction. We don't learn this distribution. Okay, so we don't assume that it's Gaussian or anything. There's very weak assumption there. Okay. Okay, so now I can talk about extrapolation. So I need to first introduce some terminology. So basically, z-hat train here will be the support of the learn factors that we see during training. And so you learn your encoder, and you look at the image of your encoder, and this is this set z-hat train. I define also the Cartesian product extension. You can skip this definition. I will just explain it with this example. So if your z-hat train looks like this, so this is a subset of R2. So maybe I have two latent vectors here, two latent components. Then its Cartesian product extension would be this square, okay? And basically the way we compute this is we essentially take this set, we project it on this axis, then we project the set again on this axis, and then we take the Cartesian product of these two projections. That gives us this square. And now we end up with this additional region that is sort of the extrapolation region. So all of this is just definitions. Here's the result that we could prove. So under the same assumptions as in the previous theorem, we can say that the learn decoder imitates the ground truth decoder, not only over the set of latent vectors that we saw during training, but over all of its Cartesian product extension. I.e., we can extrapolate, we can generate samples that were not part of the training distribution, but are still somehow on the manifold of reasonable images. If this was a bit abstract, I have examples, I have experiments to sort of show this. What I'm doing here is I'm training standard autoencoder loss with an additive decoder and an additive decoder, and I compare the two. The data set here is very simple. It's just two balls moving up and down. So I have only two latent coordinates. And what you see here is basically the learned latent space. Okay, so we take the whole data set, we push it into the encoder, and we visualize the space. Okay, so here it's only two-dimensional because I have only two latents. And you can see that for the additive decoder, it's very nicely aligned. It's very well disentangled. Whereas for the non-additive decoder, everything is sort of twisted and distorted. Okay, so I have this entanglement in the additive decoder, not in the non-additive. We can also look at the generated images, right? So what I do here is I take points of the space and I decode them, and I just visualize them. And you can see again when I change only one latent coordinate, only one ball is moving, and this is true for for all axes. Okay, so this is again disentangled, whereas it's not the case for the non-additive decoder. And maybe the thing that I really want to emphasize is this part where these samples over here were not part of the training set, so they are outside the training support, but we can still generate them, and they still sort of look good, right? And so you can see actually here that some samples are not part of the training support. We can still try to decode these points and see what they look like, and we can see that you have nice images. Okay, so I would say this is one example of how identifiable models can come with generalization guarantees. And so here generalization is extrapolation. And again, this is not the case. You cannot get extrapolation with non-additive decoder. All right. Okay, so now I'll go to the last contribution of this work, of this presentation. It's called Synergies Between Disentanglement and Sparsity, Generalization and Identifiability in Multitask Learning. So this was published at ICML last year. Okay, so we have two main contributions in this work. So the first one is, again, an identifiability result. Basically, what we show is that we are like in a multitask learning setting where basically what the assumption that we do is that each task can be solved using only a subset of features. If we make this assumption, we can show that doing sparse multitask learning is able to learn a disentangled representation. That's the first part. The second contribution is about the usefulness of disentanglement. And basically, we show a situation where using a disentangled representation can have benefits when it comes to learning with fewer samples in terms of sample complexity. All right. Let's jump to the first contribution. So here's an example. So I have multiple tasks. Each task corresponds to counting a certain number of objects. So here, the first task, I'm trying to count the number of red objects in the image, and maybe in the last task, I count the number of cubes. Okay, and so I have these different data sets, and we can model this kind of situation with a ground truth model that looks like this. And so y here would be the answer to the question. So it would be the count, right? And wt here is a sparse weight vector, and f is a shared representation. So f is shared across tasks. It doesn't change from one task to another. The only thing that can change is this weight vector wt. And basically, I want to convince you that you can represent this situation with this model. So what you can do is you can take the representation f to be basically the vector of counts. So for any combination of attributes, I have a count for that specific type of object. So for instance, the first coordinate here is just the number of big blue metallic spheres, right? The second one is number of small blue metallic spheres. Okay, so this is simple representation. And of course, I can sort of solve this problem by choosing w to be sort of a binary vector, just selecting the right objects. Okay, so this is one example. Here's the, so the question is, under which condition can we identify the features up to permutation? So when can we get disentanglement? And so here's the result. So we have this this sort of sparse multitask learning objective. And so what we do here is we optimize over theta hat, which is the parameter of my representation. And I optimize also over the task-specific weight vectors wt. And what I'm optimizing here is the L2 loss, average over data, and average over tasks. Okay, so T here is the task index. And importantly, I have this additional constraints, which is essentially telling me that the learned vector should be as sparse as the ground truth. Okay, so it's kind of similar to the constraint that we saw for graphs in the previous contribution. And so what the result says is that if I solve this optimization problem under some assumptions, I can say that the learned representation will be the same as the ground truth up to permutation and rescaling. Okay, so this is again disentanglement. And again, you can defines an equivalence relation over encoders in this case. And so the assumption that I'm making here is I assume the ground truth is the ground truth WTs are sparse, so the tasks are actually sparse, and they are sufficiently diverse in some specific sense. And the ground truth representation also has to be sort of sufficiently diverse for this to work. All right, so that's the result. I just want to say quickly that you can replace this this set of constraints by sort of a constraint on the expected sparsity, and the result doesn't change. It's basically the same conclusion with the same hypothesis. All right. Maybe a few things worth mentioning for this result. So it generalizes beyond the L2 loss. So I presented the L2 loss case just for simplicity, but it works for classification. It works for general maximum likelihood loss. We also have this is maybe the most important point. We have that the encoder F is not necessarily invertible. Okay? And so we don't assume necessarily that this encoder is invertible. And I would say this is in contrast with many works. So all the works that I presented before assumes invertibility of the map between Z and the observation X. Whereas here, we assume the encoder doesn't have to be invertible, so we can compress. I think this is a nice property because usually in representation learning, we want to remove information also. The other point I want to say is we make very weak assumption on the distribution of the features. Okay, so again, they can be dependent. So how do we solve this problem? So we have this sort of nasty L0 constraint. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of relax this problem and writing it as a variable optimization problem. So now I have in my outer problem, I'm optimizing over my representation F theta hat. And now I have an inner problem where I solve sort of this lasso regression problem where, so this is basically just lasso regression. This is L2 loss. This is your L1 regularization. And now basically I go from a L0 constraint to a L1 penalty. Again, this becomes tractable. And the way we solve this problem is via implicit differentiation. So we need to backpropagate through the solution of the inner problem. So the idea here is we want to do gradient descent on this loss. So we need to compute the gradient of this loss with respect to theta hat. Of course, we need to take into account how this solution will change when I change this parameter here. So we need to compute sort of the derivative of the solution with respect to theta hat. And this is exactly what implicit differentiation allows you to do. And you can also do it even if this objective is non-smooth because of this L1 loss. All right. Okay, so last contribution of this work. So it's about the usefulness of this entanglement. And I want to say that in the literature, we have empirical papers pointing in like all sorts of directions. So some papers say, this integral representation is useful for downstream performance. Some papers say that it doesn't. It's not useful. And so, and also there's not a lot of theory to explain, when it should be useful. And so what we wanted to do is to provide a simple theoretical argument for when this entanglement could be useful for downstream performance. Okay, so here's the argument. So we basically have, again, a data generating process. So that's y equal. This is basically the same data generating process as before. And we're given a small training set, sample from this model. And we're given two different representations. One is this entangled, right? So F is just a permutation and scaling of the ground truth. And we also have an entangled representation. And here we assume it's linearly entangled. So it's essentially a linear transformation of F, of the ground truth representation. And what I want to do is I want to sort of freeze these representation and fit a linear regression on top of it with this data. And I want to sort of study the property of these two representations. All right, so we can already see that the optimal predictor for this representation would be essentially this thing. So if you set W hat to be W times L minus 1, you can see that this is optimal for this representation, because if you do W hat times F hat, you see that L and L minus 1 will sort of cancel each other out, and you recover the ground truth model. Okay, so this is the optimal predictor for this representation. Notice that it's not necessarily sparse, right? So even if W is sparse, because of this L matrix, we're sort of mixing things together, we lose sparsity. If we do the same thing for the disintegral representation, now because the linear transformation here is a permutation and rescaling, it preserves sparsity. So if the ground truth W is sparse, the optimal predictor will also be sparse. What this means, of course, is that it suggests we should do sparsity regularization on W hat. And of course, by doing that, we have a decrease in variance, but we also, we're not paying a price in terms of bias, because we're regularizing towards sparsity, and the optimal predictor is sparse, so no bias. If you do the same thing with the entangled representation, again, you get decrease in variance. This is regularization, but you pay a price in terms of bias. And so I would say that this is a clear win for this entanglement, and yeah, because you have sort of this win-win situation here. All right, simple argument. And I want to say that this was we have toy experiments in the paper showing that this is indeed the case, and we have also this work by Marco Fumero, which is also sort of corroborating our results with image data sets. All right. Okay, so this brings me to the conclusion. So we saw how identifiable models tend to be more interpretable, so they can be used in scientific applications like biology. We saw that sometimes identifiability results comes with some kind of generalization powers. And so we saw that the learned additive structure, if you learn the additive structure, you'll get extrapolation. If you use multitask learning for disentanglement, you can use the disentangled representation to learn with fewer samples. And this is an example that I didn't give during the presentation, but is part of the thesis. You can also show that when you learn a causal graph via causal discovery, you can use the knowledge of the causal graph to predict the effect of unseen interventions. Okay, so you sort of have this pattern where you learn the structure and you can sometimes get generalization guarantees. Similarly, we saw an example of how identifiability analysis can bring insights into a machine learning algorithm. So we saw that's we saw an example with the object-centric learning methods. Okay. All right. So I want to conclude with slides on future directions and open questions. And so I believe, in deep learning, we have a lot of sort of puzzling observations in the literature. And I believe that identifiability analysis could be used to maybe tackle some of them or bring insights into some of them. So for the one I want to focus on for now is the mechanistic interpretability direction, where people are essentially, sort of taking a large language model that is already pre-trained, and they're looking for an interpretable algorithm that sort of emerged from these parameters. And so this is I think an interesting direction. But I think for me the more interesting question is, why do these algorithms emerge in the first place? And I think maybe identifiability analysis could be used to answer that, at least maybe partially. So that's one direction I think is interesting. There's also the linear mode connectivity in neural networks. So this is basically you take two neural networks. So it's the same architecture, same data set. You have just two different initialization. You train your neural network. You get to two different optimal points. Then you do a linear interpolation between these solutions. And what you do is you track the loss as you interpolate between these two solutions. And what you see is that the loss stays flat. Okay? And this is like, but you also need to permute the neurons correctly to do that. But so basically you have that the loss is flat. And so people are trying to explain that with the dynamics of SGD. But I think it might be possible to gain some understanding just by looking at the identifiability class, so the class of parameters that you can identify in a neural network. And maybe this class is convex up to permutation. So you would basically show why this is happening. All right, so there's also the question of, all of this is all very theoretical work. I think, maybe 5 or 7 years ago, it was not that clear that we could do, that we can identify the latent factors with general non-linear decoders. Now it's getting pretty clear. We have theory that at least shows that in some setting it should be possible, but we still don't have like amazing wins in practice. So I think there's an open question of how to get there. You can see this work by Philippe Lippé, who's doing interesting work in this direction. So he's applying these types of methods to robotics, so pseudo real data again. All right, so I'm already a bit over time, but we can discuss this maybe during the Q&A. But yeah, so I just want to say quickly maybe that the finite, everything I did in this thesis was in the infinite data regime, right? So we assume we have infinite data. What happens? Can we do theory also in the finite sample case? You can start with the question of consistency, right? So consistency is when you increase the number of samples and you look at what happens to your learn parameter. Now, when you have identifiability just up to an equivalence class, it's a bit hard to talk about this because you need to talk about equivalence class converging to an equivalence class. So there's a sort of a challenge there. There's also the question of model misspecification. Again, I always assume that I have enough capacity to fit the ground truth. How do you even talk about identifiability when this is not the case? Yeah, so that's an open question. And there's a question of how to encode your prior knowledge. So what we did in this thesis is we fixed the prior knowledge as a hypothesis class, right? We sort of have like uniform probability or uniform prior on the whole hypothesis class. Maybe we could be a bit more Bayesian about this and use maybe priors. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot for listening. I have maybe some special thanks I want to do before finishing. So yeah, so thanks again for the people in the audience for being here. It's really nice to have a lot of familiar faces. I also want to thank the members of the jury for once more. I want also to thank Yoshua, who was very helpful when I was applying to Mila a long time ago. You probably don't remember, but you were like, I was writing to you and you were as an undergraduate and you were extremely responsive. You answered extremely quickly. And Yoshua is very well known for that. So I'm sure everyone believes me.
Sometimes it's bimodal.
Okay, but I'm happy to be in the good mode. I also want to thank Simon, who's my supervisor. So I've known Simon for for 6 almost 7 years now, and it's been a very great experience. Simon is is obviously a very skillful researcher. I learned a lot from him. I'm always very enthusiastic to recommend Simon as a supervisor to any prospective students. I would describe my experience with Simon as being a very nice balance between having a lot of academic freedom to develop my taste in research, but also having a lot of hands-on supervision, both in terms of technical skills, but also the more sort of human side of research. And so looking forward to more collaborations. Thanks for that. And I also want to thank my parents, which are here. You can say hi, hello. Step up. No, not. No. Thanks for being extremely supportive throughout my PhD. They've been supportive in all sorts of situations in my life. So, for instance, at some point, I wanted to be a professional musician. Maybe some people, not everyone knows that, but they were also extremely supportive at that moment. So, thanks for being, thanks for your unconditional support. Also, thanks to my sister for bringing the donuts. All right, thank you.